In the freezing, blood-soaked mud of Western Europe during the bitter winter of 1944, the elite panzer commanders of the German Wehrmacht were operating under a deeply intoxicating delusion of absolute invincibility. Sitting safely inside the massive, heavily armored steel beasts known as the Tiger and the Panther, they viewed the advancing American armored divisions with complete, arrogant contempt. The German crews openly laughed at the standard American M4 Sherman tank, mockingly referring to it as a Tommy Cooker or a Ronson lighter. They knew with absolute mathematical certainty that their devastating, high-velocity 88mm guns could effortlessly rip through the thin American armor from miles away, instantly turning the Shermans into roaring, inescapable fireballs. The highly decorated German generals firmly believed that the soft, inexperienced American farm boys driving these inferior machines simply did not possess the psychological stomach for the horrific, grinding brutality of close-quarters tank warfare. They thought their massive, terrifying machines of war would easily hold the frozen defensive lines forever. But the arrogant Nazi commanders were about to experience a terrifying, hyper-violent reality check in the deep European mud. The exhausted, freezing American tank crews were not cowards, and they absolutely refused to retreat from the slaughter. Covered in thick black grease, driven completely to the brink of human sanity, and operating in a state of pure, desperate survival, the American tankers developed a shockingly brutal combat tactic. When their standard armor-piercing shells effortlessly bounced off the impenetrable German steel, the Americans didn't panic and run. Instead, they aggressively closed the distance, unleashing the absolute terrifying chaos of the death swarm. They utilized blinding speed, suicidal point-blank flanking maneuvers, and the horrific, suffocating terror of white phosphorus ammunition to completely blind and roast the enemy alive. The invincible, arrogant German steel was about to violently become a burning, inescapable iron tomb. To truly understand the absolute, suffocating terror that gripped the American armored divisions in the freezing winter of 1944, we must first examine the terrifying, heavily engineered mechanical monsters they were desperately trying to destroy. When the massive, sprawling Allied armies finally pushed their way out of the bloody hedgerows of Normandy and into the dark, freezing mud of Western Europe, the rules of armored warfare violently changed. The American commanders had built their entire tank doctrine around mass production, speed, and heavy infantry support. They relied heavily on the M4 Sherman, an incredibly reliable, easily repairable, and massively produced medium tank. The Sherman was a brilliant logistical achievement designed specifically to be efficiently loaded onto cargo ships by the thousands and sent across the vast Atlantic Ocean. But it was absolutely, fundamentally, never designed to stand toe-to-toe in a brutal, point-blank slugfest against heavily armored, dedicated tank killers. And waiting patiently for them in the freezing fog and the dark, dense forests of Germany were the absolute pinnacle of Nazi military engineering. The Panzerkampfwagen 6, universally and terrifyingly known simply as the Tiger, and its highly lethal, heavily sloped younger brother, the Panther. These were not just tanks. They were massively armored, highly complex, rolling fortresses of impenetrable Krupp steel. The German High Command had poured billions of marks and their absolute brightest engineering minds into creating heavily armed mechanical gods of the battlefield. The frontal armor of a heavy Tiger tank was an astonishing 100 millimeters of solid, hardened steel. It was a thick, unyielding iron wall that made the massive German machine practically immune to standard American anti-tank fire from the front. But the incredibly thick armor was only the secondary defensive nightmare for the advancing American tank crews. The absolute heart-stopping terror of the Tiger came from the massive, incredibly long barrel protruding from its heavy steel turret, the legendary, devastating 88mm KWK 36 gun. Originally designed as a highly successful, high-altitude anti-aircraft weapon, the German engineers had brilliantly adapted it to fire horizontally across the battlefield. The 88 fired a massive, heavy, armor-piercing shell at completely supersonic, terrifying velocities. The massive projectile flew so incredibly fast and so completely flat that the American tank crews often never even heard the deafening roar of the enemy gun firing. They simply heard a terrifying, supersonic crack in the freezing air, immediately followed by the earth-shattering, violent explosion of the Sherman tank right next to them. For the young, deeply exhausted American tank gunners, looking through their narrow, dirty optical sights, the battlefield reality was profoundly, psychologically devastating. A highly trained American gunner would carefully, desperately line up a perfect, dead-center shot on an advancing German Tiger tank. He would forcefully step on the firing pedal, violently sending a 75mm armor-piercing shell hurtling across the muddy field. The American crew would hold their breath in the suffocating, cordite-filled interior of their Sherman, desperately waiting for the massive German tank to explode in flames. Instead, they would hear a sickening, heavy, metallic ping echo across the freezing European valley. Through the heavy smoke, they would watch in absolute, paralyzing horror as their high-explosive shell simply bounced off the thick German armor like a harmless thrown pebble. It did absolutely no structural damage. It merely scratched the dark, heavily camouflaged paint of the invincible steel beast, and the horrific, deadly reality of armored warfare immediately set in. By firing that useless shot, the American Sherman had just completely, violently given away its hidden position in the dark tree line. Inside the massive, comfortable, and heavily armored turret of the Tiger tank, the arrogant, highly experienced German commander would calmly issue a firing order. The massive electric turret would smoothly, methodically rotate, bringing the terrifying long barrel of the 88 directly to bear on the fragile American tank. The ensuing German retaliation was absolutely immediate, completely merciless, and entirely fatal. The massive 88mm shell would effortlessly, violently punch completely through the thin frontal armor of the American Sherman tank as if it were made of cheap, wet cardboard. The heavy, superheated shrapnel would instantly, violently ignite the highly flammable aviation fuel and the hundreds of exposed artillery shells stored inside the American hull. The Sherman would instantly, violently erupt into a massive, roaring, inescapable fireball of completely unnatural, terrifying heat. For the terrified American crews trapped in the surrounding tanks, The psychological trauma of watching their close friends violently burn to death in the freezing mud was absolute. It was a horrific, deeply visceral nightmare of screaming metal, burning diesel, and the suffocating smell of roasted human flesh. The highly arrogant, deeply cynical German tank commanders completely understood the massive, entirely unfair technological advantage they possessed over the Americans. Looking through their pristine, highly advanced Carl Zeiss crystal optics, they openly, cruelly mocked the desperate, dying American crews. They gave the American Sherman tank terrifying, darkly humorous nicknames like the Tommy Cooker or the Ronson Lighter, because, just like the famous American cigarette lighter advertisement boldly claimed, the Sherman tank always lit the first time. It was violently struck by German steel. The German generals firmly, entirely believed that this massive, undeniable technological superiority would completely break the fighting spirit of the American armored divisions. They assumed the soft, deeply inexperienced boys from the safe, untouched American heartland would simply throw down their weapons and run in absolute terror from the invincible tigers. They completely, genuinely believed that no human being could possibly endure the psychological horror of fighting a heavily armored monster that simply could not be killed. But sitting in their massive, heavily armored steel boxes, the elite German commanders were making a deeply fatal, wildly inaccurate calculation about the American infantrymen. They completely failed to understand that when you push an American soldier into a dark, freezing, and entirely desperate corner, he does not simply surrender to the darkness. He violently, aggressively adapts to the horrific reality of the slaughter. The surviving American tank crews wiped the freezing mud and the dark, thick grease from their exhausted faces. They looked at the massive, burning, blackened husks of their destroyed platoons, and a deep, cold, entirely ruthless fury began to take hold. If they could not pierce the heavy German armor from a safe, comfortable distance, they would simply have to close the gap. They would have to completely abandon the traditional, clean rules of armored warfare and drag the arrogant German knights directly down into the bloody, suffocating mud with them. The terrifying era of the invincible, untouchable German Tiger tank was about to violently, aggressively collide with the absolute desperate ferocity of the American death swarm. The brutal, completely unforgiving reality of the European winter of 1944 forced the American armored divisions into a dark, deeply terrifying psychological corner. They had been promised that their massive industrial war machine would easily roll over the remnants of the defeated German army, but instead they were bleeding out in the freezing mud, violently outgunned and hopelessly out-armored by the terrifying German panzer divisions. The traditional, highly polished military textbooks of armored warfare, written by clean generals in safe, warm offices back in Washington, were completely, absolutely useless here. The textbook clearly stated that a medium tank should simply engage an enemy tank from a safe, comfortable distance, utilizing superior optical sights and accurate artillery. But the young, deeply exhausted American boys driving the M4 Shermans quickly realized that following those clean rules was an absolute guaranteed death sentence. If they engaged a German Tiger or Panther at a distance, The massive 88mm gun would violently slaughter them long before their own 75mm shells could even scratch the German paint. They needed a radical, hyper-violent, and completely suicidal new tactic to survive the bloody European meat grinder. The surviving American tank commanders, men who had violently watched their closest friends burn alive in the smoking metal husks of destroyed Shermans, accepted a grim, horrifying new reality. It was a terrifying, deeply cynical battlefield equation that became known as the brutal mathematics of the Western Front. They universally understood that to successfully kill a single, heavily armored German Tiger tank, they would have to completely sacrifice at least 3 or 4 of their own Shermans. It was an absolute blood-soaked suicide pact, forged in the freezing mud and the heavy black grease of the engine compartments. When a hidden, heavily camouflaged German Tiger was finally spotted aggressively locking down a muddy European crossroads, the American radio networks did not panic. Instead, a chilling, deeply coordinated silence fell over the exhausted American platoon. The lead American Sherman tank, often commanded by the most fiercely aggressive or the absolute most unlucky man in the unit, became the designated bait. The American driver would violently slam his heavy combat boots down on the accelerator, pushing the massive Ford V8 engine to the absolute brink of mechanical failure. The Sherman would aggressively burst out of the dark, protective tree line, its steel tracks violently throwing thick chunks of freezing mud into the cold winter air. The young American crew completely understood that they were driving directly into the jaws of a heavily armored mechanical god that could not miss. They were purposefully, aggressively drawing the terrifying attention of the massive German gun directly onto their own thin, highly vulnerable frontal armor. Inside the pristine, heavily armored turret of the German Tiger, the highly arrogant Panzer commander would confidently smile at the sheer, pathetic stupidity of the American charge. He would calmly order his heavily experienced gunner to slowly track the bouncing, charging American Sherman through the crystal-clear crosshairs of his Zeiss optics. The massive, terrifying German 88 would violently roar, unleashing a blinding, earth-shattering wave of concussive force across the snowy field. The heavy, armor-piercing German shell would effortlessly, instantly punch right through the heavy steel of the American bait tank. The charging Sherman would violently erupt into a massive, blinding fireball of superheated aviation fuel, violently stopping dead in the freezing mud. But this horrific, violent sacrifice was exactly what the brilliant, desperate American death swarm absolutely required. While the arrogant German crew was entirely focused on violently destroying the lead Sherman and taking precious, agonizing seconds to mechanically reload their massive gun. The rest of the heavily exhausted American tank platoon aggressively launched their horrific, high-speed flanking maneuver. 3 or 4 surviving American Shermans would violently accelerate out of the dark woods from completely opposite, highly unpredictable directions. They completely abandoned any attempt at accurate long-range firing, pushing their roaring engines to maximum speed over the deeply cratered, muddy terrain. The American drivers violently shifted gears, desperately bouncing the 30-ton metal beasts over frozen ditches and shattered tree stumps. The American gunners simply held their fire, their hands sweating profusely on the firing triggers, waiting until they were terrifyingly close to the massive German monster. Inside the heavily armored Tiger tank, the arrogant smile of the German commander completely, violently vanished. He suddenly realized, with absolute, paralyzing horror, that the pathetic, inferior Americans were not retreating in fear from the burning wreckage of their comrade. They were aggressively, suicidally swarming his invincible heavy tank like a pack of starving, incredibly violent, mechanical wolves. The German commander frantically screamed over the internal radio, desperately ordering his gunner and driver to rapidly traverse the massive, heavily armored turret to meet the new threats. But this was the absolute, singular, fatal flaw of the magnificent German engineering that the desperate Americans were brutally exploiting. The heavy, impenetrable armor of the Tiger tank made it incredibly massive, but it also made the electric turret traverse terrifyingly, agonizingly slow. The heavy German gun simply could not physically rotate fast enough to track multiple high-speed American targets, violently rushing them from the flanks. The German crew listened in absolute suffocating terror as the roaring, high-pitched engines of the American Shermans closed to within mere yards of their heavy steel hull. An aggressively driven American Sherman would violently skid to a halt in the deep mud, positioning itself perfectly, squarely behind the massive German Tiger. This was the absolute critical moment that the bloody American sacrifice had been designed to create. While the front armor of the Tiger was an impenetrable 100 millimeters of solid Krupp steel, the rear armor protecting the vital Maybach engine was relatively paper-thin. The heavily exhausted, grease-covered American gunner, staring through a dirty sight at point-blank range, would finally violently pull the heavy-firing trigger. The 75-millimeter American armor-piercing shell would absolutely, effortlessly, violently shatter the thin rear armor plate of the German beast. It would violently tear directly into the massive, highly complex German engine block, instantly igniting the heavy fuel lines and the massive ammunition stores. The supposedly invincible, heavily armored mechanical god of the German Wehrmacht would instantly, violently erupt into a massive, roaring pillar of dark black smoke and twisting fire. The sheer, absolute psychological shock for the surrounding German infantry and the surviving panzer commanders was profound and completely devastating. They had firmly believed that the American farm boys were entirely soft, completely undisciplined, and entirely incapable of enduring horrific casualties. But they had just witnessed an incredibly violent, suicidal, and brilliantly coordinated display of pure, unadulterated battlefield aggression. The soft Americans had violently proven that they were entirely willing to drown the supposedly invincible German war machine in their own blood and freezing mud. The terrifying myth of the untouchable German Tiger tank was officially, violently bleeding out in the dark European forests, completely crushed by the sheer, desperate ferocity of the American swarm. The brutal, freezing battlefields of Western Europe were a constantly evolving, deeply terrifying chess match of mechanized slaughter. As the catastrophic, blood-soaked winter of 1944 relentlessly ground on, the highly experienced German panzer commanders began to violently adapt to the American death swarm. They were profoundly, deeply humiliated that their invincible, massively armored Tiger and Panther tanks were being successfully destroyed by the inferior, paper-thin M4 Shermans. The arrogant German generals immediately issued strict, heavily enforced tactical directives to completely eliminate the vulnerability of their thin rear armor. They absolutely forbade the heavy German tanks from aggressively operating alone or violently pushing forward into open, deeply exposed American territory. Instead, they ordered the massive steel beasts to remain heavily entrenched in the dark, dense European forests, carefully hiding within the freezing shadows of ruined stone villages. They strictly operated in highly coordinated, overlapping defensive pairs, aggressively protecting each other's highly vulnerable flanks from the high-speed American flanking maneuvers. And most terrifyingly, the heavy German tanks were now intimately supported by deeply fanatical, heavily armed squads of Panzer Grenadier infantry. These hardened German soldiers crouched silently in the freezing mud, aggressively wielding the deadly, highly effective Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket launchers. If an aggressively driven American Sherman attempted to violently accelerate and swing behind a heavily camouflaged Tiger, the hidden German infantry would instantly, mercilessly obliterate them from the dark tree line. The brutal, bloody mathematics of the Western Front had violently changed yet again, and the massive, impenetrable frontal armor of the German monsters was once again an absolute paralyzing nightmare. The heavily exhausted, grease-stained American tank crews were completely, violently forced back to square one. They could no longer rely on suicidal, high-speed flanking runs to completely bypass the massive, terrifying 88mm guns. They were violently forced to stare directly into the dark, heavily armored face of the German mechanical god, and they desperately needed a new, incredibly violent solution. And they found that highly controversial, deeply terrifying solution stacked in the dark, cramped ammunition racks of their own M4 Shermans. It was officially, clinically designated as the M64 white phosphorus shell, but the deeply cynical American infantrymen affectionately and fearfully simply called it Willie Pete. Originally, this highly specialized American artillery shell was strictly designed to be a non-lethal, purely tactical tool for the battlefield. It was intended to be aggressively fired into the open terrain to instantly create a massive, blinding wall of incredibly thick white smoke, hiding the advancing American infantry from enemy machine guns. But the desperate, deeply traumatized American tank gunners rapidly discovered that Willie Pete possessed a highly offensive, entirely horrific secondary characteristic. When the massive heavy glass and metal casing of the American phosphorus shell violently shattered against the impenetrable Krupp steel of a German tank, it did not attempt to pierce the armor. Instead, it instantly violently dispersed a massive, blinding cloud of highly reactive chemical flakes directly across the exterior of the German machine. The absolute terrifying reality of white phosphorus is that it instantly, violently ignites the exact moment it aggressively makes contact with the oxygen in the freezing air. It does not simply burn. It violently detonates into a clinging, inescapable chemical fire that aggressively burns at a staggering, mind-melting 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It is completely, absolutely impossible to extinguish with freezing water or heavy winter mud. It simply continues to violently burn until the chemical completely consumes itself. The exhausted, highly aggressive American tank crews completely abandoned standard armor-piercing shells when violently confronting a heavily entrenched German Tiger from the front. Instead, the American gunner would violently slam the heavy firing pedal, intentionally, aggressively shooting a Willie Pete shell directly at the massive sloped frontal armor or the heavy gun mantlet of the German beast. Inside the pristine, heavily armored and entirely arrogant command turret of the German Tiger, the highly experienced crew would initially cruelly laugh at the American desperation. They would hear the dull, heavy thud of the American shell violently striking their impenetrable steel, completely confident that their massive armor had once again effortlessly saved them. But their arrogant, deeply ingrained sense of absolute mechanical superiority would violently, permanently shatter within a matter of agonizing seconds. The massive, completely blinding explosion of American white phosphorus did not need to physically penetrate the thick German steel to destroy the men hiding inside. The intense, terrifyingly hot chemical fire instantly completely enveloped the entire massive German tank in a clinging, blinding, inescapable blanket of glowing white destruction. The heavy, highly complex optical sights of the German 88mm gun were instantly, permanently blinded by the glowing, melting chemical slag and the incredibly thick, impenetrable smoke. The highly arrogant German commander, previously looking through his crystal-clear Zeiss optics, was suddenly, completely, violently plunged into absolute, terrifying blindness. But the absolute most horrific psychological weapon of the American Willie Pete shell was the terrifying, choking nature of the smoke itself. The massive, heavy Maybach 1512 engine that powered the massive German Tiger tank aggressively required massive amounts of fresh oxygen to effectively operate. The heavy German engine cooling fans violently, aggressively sucked the surrounding outside air directly into the dark, heavily armored engine compartment and the enclosed crew cabin. When the massive, blinding cloud of American white phosphorus violently erupted directly on the hull, the heavy German ventilation system actively pulled the deeply toxic, burning chemical smoke straight into the tank. The pristine, heavily engineered interior of the invincible German war machine was instantly, violently transformed into a dark, suffocating, completely inescapable gas chamber. The deeply toxic, burning white smoke violently seared the lungs and the watering eyes of the highly trained German crew. The absolute, paralyzing psychological terror of suffocation and burning alive violently overrode years of strict, fanatical Nazi military discipline. The German crew simply could not mathematically comprehend what was violently happening to their indestructible fortress. Coughing violently, blinded by the burning smoke, and deeply terrified that their heavy ammunition was about to catastrophically detonate from the intense external heat, they completely panicked. They desperately, violently threw open the heavy steel top hatches of their Tiger tank, aggressively abandoning their magnificent, impenetrable armor in a desperate, frantic bid for fresh air. And that was the exact, horrific, blood-soaked moment the deeply exhausted American tank crews had been aggressively, patiently waiting for. As the terrified, coughing German crew desperately scrambled out of the smoking, burning hatches of their heavy tank, They violently exposed their soft, unarmored bodies to the freezing winter air. The American Shermans immediately violently opened fire with every single heavy 50 caliber and 30 caliber machine gun they possessed. They mercilessly, violently cut down the fleeing, arrogant German tank crews in a massive, deafening hail of completely inescapable lead. The terrified German commanders finally, violently realized that their massive, impenetrable steel armor was entirely, completely useless against the horrific, blinding chemical fury of the desperate American tanker. The invincible, arrogant knights of the German panzer divisions were violently, aggressively forced to burn in the freezing mud, completely broken by the terrifying, suffocating reality of Willie Pete, by the bitter, completely unforgiving winter of late 1944, the absolute crushing industrial reality of the Second World War was violently closing in on the Third Reich. The once invincible German army was bleeding out on multiple fronts. Their cities were being relentlessly pulverized into ash from the sky, and their massive tank factories were desperate for steel. But Adolf Hitler, deeply consumed by a terrifying fanatical delusion of absolute racial destiny, refused to completely surrender to the American advance. Instead, he aggressively orchestrated one final massive and entirely desperate apocalyptic gamble in the freezing, snow-covered pine forests of the Ardennes. The German High Command secretly, meticulously gathered the absolute last of their elite panzer divisions, hiding thousands of heavily armored machines beneath the dark canopy of the winter trees. They violently scraped the bottom of their industrial barrel to deploy the absolute most terrifying, heavily armored monster ever to crush the European mud beneath its massive steel tracks. The Panzerkampfwagen 6 Ausführung B, universally and fearfully known by the exhausted Allied troops as the King Tiger. Weighing an absolutely staggering 70 tons and boasting incredibly thick, highly sloped, impenetrable armor, it was a terrifying mechanical behemoth designed for pure, unadulterated slaughter. The arrogant, deeply indoctrinated German generals firmly believed that if they unleashed this massive, unstoppable wall of heavy Krupp steel in a sudden, violent surprise attack, the American lines would completely, instantly shatter. They heavily relied on a massive, thick winter weather system that had completely blanketed the Ardennes forest in a dense, freezing, impenetrable gray fog. This horrific, blinding weather violently grounded the massive fleets of American tactical bomber aircraft, entirely robbing the United States Army of its absolute greatest battlefield advantage. On the dark, freezing morning of December 16th, the massive, earth-shattering roar of thousands of German artillery pieces violently shattered the silent winter forest. The terrifying Battle of the Bulge had aggressively, violently begun. Massive columns of heavily armored German Tigers, King Tigers, and Panthers aggressively surged forward through the deep snow, violently crashing into the thin, heavily outnumbered American defensive lines. The arrogant German tank commanders, standing proudly in the open hatches of their massive steel beasts, genuinely expected a total, panic-stricken American collapse. They fully expected the exhausted, freezing American infantrymen and the heavily outgunned Sherman tank crews to simply drop their weapons and run in absolute terror from the massive German onslaught. But the elite, highly confident German commanders had once again profoundly, fatally misjudged the terrifying, deep-seated resilience of the American combat soldier. In freezing, completely surrounded crossroads, towns like Bastogne, the heavily battered American airborne infantry and the surviving armored platoons absolutely refused to break. They violently dug into the frozen, blood-soaked earth, aggressively fighting the massive German tanks at point-blank range with bazookas, desperate artillery strikes, and pure, unfiltered hatred. The arrogant German armored offensive rapidly, violently bogged down in the narrow, deeply snow-choked forest roads, completely frustrated by the unyielding, fanatical American defense. They were rapidly burning through their incredibly limited, precious reserves of heavy diesel fuel, heavily idling their massive Maybach engines, while trapped behind blown bridges and destroyed American Sherman tanks. And then, just days before Christmas, the absolute final terrifying nail was violently hammered into the coffin of the German Panzerwaffe. The heavy, freezing gray clouds that had aggressively shielded the arrogant German tanks from absolute destruction finally, violently broke apart. The dense winter fog aggressively evaporated, violently revealing a brilliantly clear, stunningly bright blue winter sky over the heavily cratered Ardennes forest. Inside the dark, freezing turrets of the massive King Tigers, the heavily exhausted German crews looked up through their thick optical periscopes and felt an absolute paralyzing wave of pure psychological terror. They were completely out of fuel, completely trapped on narrow, snow-covered dirt roads, and entirely violently exposed to the open sky. And immediately the deafening, terrifying roar of massive American radial engines violently echoed across the frozen European valleys. The United States Army Air Forces had aggressively arrived, violently unleashing massive swarms of heavily armed Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers. The massive, rugged American aircraft, affectionately known as the Jug, was flying incredibly low, aggressively hunting the dark, geometric silhouettes of the German tanks against the bright white snow. For the arrogant, deeply terrified German tank commanders, the absolute, inescapable nightmare of total air superiority had violently begun. The massive, impenetrable 150mm frontal armor of the fearsome King Tiger was entirely, completely useless against a violent attack from directly above. The heavy American Thunderbolts violently, aggressively dove out of the bright sun, unleashing terrifying, highly accurate salvos of massive, high-explosive, unguided rockets. The 5-inch American rockets would violently, effortlessly shatter the relatively thin, highly vulnerable top armor of the German turrets and engine decks. The incredibly massive, heavily engineered German beasts would instantly, violently erupt into towering, roaring geysers of bright orange fire and completely black, suffocating smoke. If the American pilots aggressively ran out of heavy rockets, they simply dropped down to treetop level and violently strafed the desperate, fleeing German columns with massive banks of heavy .50 caliber machine guns. The heavy American armor-piercing incendiary rounds violently ripped through the exposed fuel trucks, the soft-skinned half-tracks, and the terrified, completely exposed German Panzer Grenadiers desperately trying to run through the deep snow. The arrogant, unstoppable German armored offensive was violently, entirely transformed into a horrific, blood-soaked highway of absolute burning mechanical death. The highly experienced German crews, men who had previously arrogantly laughed at the burning American Shermans, completely panicked. They desperately, violently abandoned their completely pristine, fully functional King Tigers in the deep snow, terrified of being roasted alive inside the massive steel ovens. They furiously ran into the dark, freezing woods, completely leaving behind the absolute greatest, most heavily advanced tanks the Third Reich had ever produced. The terrifying myth of the invincible, heavily armored German panzer was officially, violently slaughtered in the freezing mud and snow of the Ardennes. The arrogant Nazi war machine had violently collided with the overwhelming, completely unyielding industrial and aerial wrath of the United States military. And it had been completely, permanently reduced to burning scrap metal. The violent, blood-soaked collapse of the massive German armored offensive in the frozen Ardennes forest was not merely a temporary tactical defeat for the Third Reich. It was the absolute, permanent, and entirely catastrophic death rattle of the once invincible German Panzerwaffe. The arrogant, heavily indoctrinated German generals, men who had previously conquered entire European nations in a matter of weeks, were finally violently forced to face a terrifying mathematical reality. They had built a terrifyingly advanced, incredibly lethal, and massively armored mechanical god in the Tiger and the Panther tanks. But they had fundamentally, fatally failed to understand that the brutal, grinding reality of modern global warfare is not won by a small handful of invincible, over-engineered garage projects. It is won by massive, unyielding, and completely terrifying industrial logistics. As the heavy winter snows finally violently melted into the thick, dark mud of the European spring of 1945, the sprawling American armored divisions relentlessly pushed directly into the dark heart of the German homeland. The pristine, highly complex German tanks were completely out of vital aviation fuel, completely out of heavy tungsten ammunition, and completely out of desperately needed spare parts. When a massive 70-ton German King Tiger violently shattered its highly fragile, overstressed transmission on a muddy dirt road, it was an absolute permanent mechanical casualty. The deeply exhausted, completely broken German crews had absolutely no massive recovery vehicles capable of towing the massive beasts, and absolutely no factory-fresh replacement parts. They were violently, humiliatingly forced to plant highly explosive thermite charges directly inside their own beautiful, completely pristine turrets. They violently blew their own magnificent machines to entirely unrecognizable pieces of blackened scrap metal, completely terrified that the advancing Americans would capture their technological secrets. But the incredibly vast, terrifyingly massive American war machine was operating on an entirely different, entirely unstoppable level of industrial violence. When an American M4 Sherman tank was violently heavily damaged or completely destroyed in the brutal, bloody street fighting of a ruined German city, the American logistical train simply did not blink. Within a matter of hours, massive, highly efficient American tank recovery vehicles would aggressively, violently drag the smoking, blackened steel husk back behind the front lines. The incredibly exhausted but entirely relentless American mechanics would violently hose the freezing mud and the horrific human blood out of the dark, cramped interiors. They would aggressively weld thick, heavy steel patches directly over the violent, gaping holes left by the German 88mm shells. They would violently drop a massive, factory-fresh Ford V8 engine directly into the hull and immediately aggressively hand the keys to a completely fresh, highly aggressive crew of young American farm boys. And the massive, terrifying, completely unstoppable wave of olive-drab American steel simply kept violently rolling forward over the shattered, burning ruins of the Third Reich. The arrogant, elite German tank commanders, previously safely protected behind 100 millimeters of impenetrable Krupp steel, were entirely, permanently broken. They had completely, genuinely believed that their undeniable, massive mechanical superiority would effortlessly shatter the psychological resolve of the soft American infantrymen. They entirely assumed that the Americans would simply run in absolute terror from a heavily armored monster that mathematical logic dictated they simply could not kill. But the young, heavily exhausted and entirely grease-covered American tankers had aggressively, violently proven the absolute darkest, most terrifying reality of armored warfare. They violently proved that a heavily armored, invincible machine is completely, entirely useless if the men fighting inside the supposedly inferior tanks are absolutely, fanatically willing to die in the freezing mud to destroy you. The completely desperate, horrifyingly violent, and incredibly suicidal tactics of the American death swarm had successfully dragged the arrogant German knights directly into a suffocating, blood-soaked grave. Today, the dark, freezing pine forests of the Ardennes and the quiet, peaceful farming fields of Western Europe are completely silent. But scattered across the incredibly vast, deeply scarred landscape, quietly rusting away in dark, forgotten museums and entirely silent monuments, are the massive, heavy steel husks of the German tigers. They silently stand as a permanent, incredibly stark, and deeply terrifying reminder to the entire world. A massive, permanent monument to the absolute, fatal arrogance of underestimating the relentless, blood-soaked mechanical fury and the unbreakable, savage resilience of the American combat soldier. Thank you so incredibly much for joining us on this deep, horrifying, and incredibly visceral journey into the absolute darkest, most terrifying realities of armored warfare on the Western Front. If you truly, deeply enjoyed this massive, feature-length historical dive into the brutal, claustrophobic mud and the screaming, burning steel of the Second World War, you must do us a massive favor right now. Absolutely, violently destroy that like button down below until it is completely unrecognizable. It massively, aggressively feeds the YouTube algorithm, entirely allowing us to continue actively producing these incredibly deep, terrifyingly detailed military documentaries for you every single week. You absolutely must hit that subscribe button right now and violently ring the notification bell, ensuring you are instantly, immediately deployed with us when our next massive historical deep dive goes live. We are aggressively, actively building the absolute greatest, most completely terrifying library of untold military history on this entire platform, and you absolutely cannot afford to miss a single blood-soaked episode. And before you finally safely climb out of the dark, suffocating turret of this video, we absolutely need to hear your direct orders down in the comments section below. What highly specific, deeply terrifying military engagement, legendary forgotten weapon system, or absolute blood-soaked campaign should we violently dissect and completely uncover in our next massive episode? Should we aggressively return to the dark, freezing depths of the Atlantic Ocean, or violently storm the incredibly bloody, volcanic black sand beaches of the Pacific Theater? Your direct comments aggressively dictate the absolute future and the exact precise tactical direction of this entire channel, so sound off immediately and let us know exactly where we should deploy our heavy armor next. Until then, always entirely respect the terrifying history, stay incredibly, deeply curious, and we will absolutely, violently see you on the next battlefield.